Snow fell without mercy over the Vermont mountains that night. A mother German shepherd trudged through the blizzard, one tiny puppy hanging from her jaws, 8 more trailing behind like shadows in the white. She wasn't running away from danger. She was carrying hope toward it. Miles away, inside a wooden cabin, a Navy SEAL sat alone by the fire, the war still raging behind his eyes. He thought the world had already taken everything worth saving, until a faint scratching at his door broke the silence, and when he opened it, he didn't just find a dog. He found a reason to keep fighting. The world had fallen silent beneath a heavy quilt of snow. In the Vermont mountains, the trees stood motionless, their branches bowing under the weight of white. The storm had been raging for 3 days, turning the forest into a blurred memory of itself. Even sound seemed frozen in the air, waiting for the wind's permission to move again. Inside a small wooden cabin, a single lamp flickered against the storm's gray light. Lucas Grant sat by the hearth, shoulders hunched, staring into the fire as if it might give him answers. He was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his once dark hair now streaked with early gray. His face carried the rough edges of a man shaped by discipline, square jaw, weathered skin, faint scars tracing his cheek and neck. But behind his steel-blue eyes lingered something else, a quiet ache, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Lucas had once been a Navy SEAL. Years of service had honed him into something unbreakable, or so he'd believed. But after the war ended, silence became his enemy. He couldn't stand the sound of crowds, or the laughter of people who hadn't seen what he had. So he left. He traded desert heat for snow, gunfire for wind, commands for solitude. Vermont offered him peace, or perhaps a place to fall apart in peace. No one here asked questions. No one called him sir. The cabin was the last thing his team leader had given him before retiring, saying simply, "You'll need a place to be small again." The fire cracked softly. Lucas rubbed his hands together, the warmth barely reaching through the weight in his chest. He hadn't spoken to another person in days. Even the radio sat silent, its cord unplugged. The only sound came from the hiss of the storm against the windows, and the creak of the pine beams shifting in the cold. Then, something new. A noise that didn't belong to the wind. A faint, uneven scrape on the porch boards. He froze, instincts firing awake after months of dormancy. For a heartbeat, the cabin felt like a combat zone again, his body alert, pulse steady, breath controlled. The scraping came again, followed by a pause, then another. It wasn't the rhythm of branches or falling snow. It was something alive. Lucas stood slowly, boots heavy on the wooden floor. He reached for the doorknob, half expecting nothing, half fearing what memory might conjure. When he opened the door, the wind burst in, scattering snowflakes across the floor like shards of glass. The sky was dim and colorless, the air thick with flurries, and there, framed in the doorway, stood a German shepherd. Her fur was a tapestry of black and tan, the colors dulled by wet snow clinging to her sides. She was strong, but thin, ribs faintly visible beneath her coat. In her mouth she held something small and fragile. A puppy, limp but breathing, its tiny paws dangling. Behind her, in the shadowed whiteness, several other pups struggled to keep up, their steps slow and uncertain as they followed their mother's trail. The mother didn't bark, she didn't whine, she just stood there, eyes amber gold, calm and watchful. Lucas met her gaze and felt his chest tighten. It wasn't fear he saw in her eyes. It was resolve, the kind of quiet strength that only those who have run out of options can possess. He crouched, lowering himself to her height. "Hey, girl," his voice rough from disuse. You picked a bad night to travel. The shepherd tilted her head slightly, snow falling from her ears. The puppy whimpered once, a sound so small it seemed to vanish in the wind. Lucas felt something stir deep inside him. A memory, maybe, or a promise he thought he'd forgotten. For a moment, he wasn't standing in a Vermont cabin anymore. He was 25 again, kneeling in the dust of Kandahar, holding a bleeding friend under the desert moon. He could still hear the helicopter blades, the shouting, the last words, "Go! Don't look back!" He'd looked back anyway. He always did. The storm brought him back to the present. The dog's eyes were still locked on his. She didn't beg. She waited. Lucas realized she was asking permission, not for help, but for space. He stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, it's warm in here." The dog hesitated. The pups behind her shifted uncertainly, whining. Then, with deliberate care, she stepped onto the porch. Her paws left dark prints in the snow, footprints in perfect pairs. She crossed the threshold, moved to the rug by the fire, and lowered her head. The puppy slipped gently from her mouth onto the floor, tiny and shivering, but alive. The mother gave one quiet sniff, turned back toward the door, and disappeared into the storm again. Lucas stared after her, heart pounding. He stood motionless for several seconds, then grabbed a blanket from the chair and wrapped the small pup, placing it near the hearth. It was weak, but breathing. The warmth would help. He looked toward the door again. Minutes passed. Then she returned. Another puppy hung from her mouth. Snow stuck to its fur like crystals. She stepped inside, placed it beside the first, and went back out. Again. And again she came, each time slower, each trip a fight against exhaustion and the storm's weight. By the fourth trip, her legs trembled as she crossed the porch. By the sixth, her breath came in harsh clouds. Lucas found himself standing by the door, unable to look away. The rhythm of her movement out into death, back into life, was something he understood too well. He whispered to himself almost reverently, "You're a soldier too, aren't you?" Outside, the snow swirled harder, covering the prints she'd left behind. But the door stayed open. The fire burned steady, and the sound of her paws against the wood echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet cabin. She returned again and again. And Lucas, once a man who had shut the world out, simply waited, letting her come home, one small life at a time. At last, she crossed the threshold once more, another tiny bundle hanging from her jaws. The wind followed her in, scattering flakes across the rug. She set the puppy down beside the others, then turned toward the door. Her eyes flicked toward Lucas, as if to ask for nothing but space and understanding. He took one step back and opened the door wider. The mother dog hesitated only for a moment, then walked past him into the storm again, disappearing into white. The firelight glowed behind her like a beacon, waiting. Lucas stood there in silence, the cold brushing his face, his hands trembling, but not from the chill. He felt something uncoil in his chest, something warm and fragile he hadn't felt since before the war. And when she returned once more, carrying another pup, he was ready. He stepped aside fully. "You know where the fire is?" The German shepherd walked past him, her body brushing lightly against his leg as she entered. She laid the puppy down by the others, then turned again toward the storm. Lucas didn't move. He just watched. He knew she wasn't done yet, and so he waited, keeping the door open to the dark, letting the snow fall into the room, letting the warmth spill out onto the porch, because some doors, he thought, were never meant to stay closed. By the time the storm swallowed her shape again, Lucas's decision was made. He would wait as long as it took. When she returned for the final time, slower than before, her fur heavy with ice, he could see her ribs rise and fall in painful rhythm. But she didn't stop. She crossed the porch, carrying her last pup carefully between her teeth. She stepped inside one last time, placed it beside its siblings, and stood still. Lucas met her gaze. No words were needed. He closed the door gently behind her, shutting out the wind. The firelight flickered over her wet fur as she circled her litter, then lay down, curling protectively around the tiny bodies. Lucas crouched nearby, the warmth reaching both of them now. For the first time in years, he felt something real move in his chest, a pulse, a promise, a beginning. And as the snow whispered against the cabin walls, Lucas realized he had just witnessed a miracle, a mother's endurance, and a soldier's return to life, both found in the same storm. Morning came slowly, like a reluctant confession. The storm had quieted, leaving the forest wrapped in a soft silence that felt almost sacred. Pale light filtered through the frosted windows of the cabin, revealing the shape of life scattered across the rug. 8 tiny German Shepherd puppies curled into one trembling heap, their mother lying around them like a living wall. Steam rose faintly from their damp fur as the fire crackled, steady and strong. Lucas Grant hadn't slept. He sat on the floor beside the hearth, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the scene before him. The firelight danced across his face, deepening the lines that years of service had carved into his skin. His beard, just a few days past trimmed, had caught bits of ash. The same calloused hands that once gripped rifles and ropes now fumbled clumsily with an old wool blanket. He tore it into smaller pieces, folding each into makeshift bedding for the pups. They shifted weakly, finding comfort in the warmth, tiny paws twitching in dreams. Each time the mother stirred, she lifted her head toward him, alert, but calm. He had learned something in the night. That trust didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like heat, slowly reaching the corners of a cold room, her eyes no longer guarded, but watchful. As if she'd decided that whatever he wasn't danger. Lucas leaned back, rubbing his sore shoulder. The scar there ached whenever the weather turned cold, a memory stitched into his flesh from a night in Mosul. His team had been ambushed. A friend named Miller hadn't made it out. Lucas carried that loss the way he carried the cold, quietly, every day, never speaking of it. Maybe that was why he couldn't bring himself to turn the mother dog away. She too carried what she loved through the storm. By mid-morning, hunger broke the peace. The pups began to stir and whine softly, their cries thin but insistent. The mother rose slowly, stretching her lean frame, her fur still matted from the storm. Lucas reached for the cupboard, remembering the canned soup and the half-bag of powdered milk he'd stored for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He filled a pot with water from the kettle, stirring the milk until it frothed faintly. The smell of warmth spread through the cabin. The mother tilted her head, nose twitching. Lucas poured the mixture into a shallow bowl, setting it on the floor near her. "For you." She hesitated, sniffed once, and then lapped at the milk, slow and steady. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Watching her eat felt strangely intimate, like witnessing survival stripped to its simplest form. The radio on the shelf crackled suddenly, startling him. He hadn't touched it since the storm began. Static filled the air, followed by the soft hum of a familiar voice. It was Martha Higgins. "Lucas, dear, I'm just checking in." Her tone gentle but firm. "The roads are still bad, but I left something by your porch early this morning." You'll find it by the step. Don't let it freeze. He looked toward the door, confused. When he opened it, the cold bit instantly at his skin. But there it was, a woven basket resting against the porch rail, half buried in snow. Inside lay a loaf of bread, a jar of soup, and a folded note wrapped in plastic. He carried it inside, brushed off the snow, and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, the ink faintly smudged by moisture. Some guests aren't sent for saving, Lucas. Some are sent to teach us how to love again. He stared at the words for a long time. Then he glanced toward the fire, toward the mother dog, now curled protectively around her pups. Something inside him stirred. Not quite sorrow, not yet peace. Something between. By afternoon, the cabin smelled of melted snow, wood smoke, and life. Lucas found himself talking softly as he moved about, not to any human ear, but to her. "You've done good, girl," he murmured as he laid fresh logs on the fire. "Storm like that? You must have been out there for days." She lifted her head, ears twitching, amber eyes bright against the dim room. There was an intelligence in that gaze, something almost human. When one of the puppies squeaked, she turned back immediately, nudging it closer with her nose, a gesture so tender Lucas had to look away. Outside, the storm clouds broke apart, revealing streaks of pale blue sky. The light shifted across the cabin floor, catching dust motes and flakes of ash in its path. The peace felt fragile, like glass, beautiful, but one wrong move could shatter it. That evening, Martha's old pickup truck appeared at the edge of the woods. She was a small woman, bundled in a thick coat, her silver hair pulled back neatly beneath a knitted cap. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. She didn't knock. She simply called out from the porch, "Permission to approach, sailor." Lucas smiled for the first time in days. "You're cleared for entry, ma'am." Martha stepped in, stamping the snow from her boots. "Well," she said softly when she saw the family by the fire, "seems you've got yourself company." "Found them last night," Lucas replied, scratching his beard. "Or maybe they found me." Martha knelt slowly beside the dogs, her joints stiff, but her movements careful. "She's beautiful," she whispered, reaching out but stopping short of touching. "Look at her eyes. She's not afraid of you." "No," Lucas said quietly. "Not anymore." Martha stood and looked around the cabin, her gaze landing on the blanket-covered floor, the bowls, the fresh firewood. "You've done well. You always did have a soft spot under that uniform." He shook his head. "Soft isn't the word I'd use." "Then maybe it's the word you needed to remember," she replied, giving him a faint smile. "Don't forget to feed yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup." She left not long after, her footprints vanishing quickly under the falling snow. Lucas stood at the window, watching her truck disappear into the trees. He thought about her words, about cups and emptiness, and realized for the first time how long he'd been running on nothing. The fire popped, breaking his thoughts. The mother dog shifted, curling tighter around her pups. The smallest one squeaked in its sleep, then nestled closer to her warmth. The sight was enough to pull a small, quiet smile to his lips. He moved to the window seat, pulling the old wool blanket over his shoulders. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Not fierce this time, but soft, like forgiveness. The forest breathed beneath it, slow and calm. Lucas leaned his head against the wooden frame, his eyes tracing the shapes of the pines through the frost. For years, he had lived in a world that demanded hardness. But now, surrounded by the sound of breathing, crackling fire, and the steady rhythm of survival, he felt something thaw inside him. He watched the flames flicker and thought about Martha's note. Maybe she was right. Maybe some guests came not to be saved, but to save what was left in others. The puppies slept, the mother rested, the fire burned on. And for the first time in a very long time, Lucas Grant's heart wasn't cold anymore. The morning came pale and windless. The kind of quiet that follows a storm and feels almost dishonest. The forest outside Lucas's cabin glistened under a thin crust of ice, each pine branch glittering faintly like glass. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, leaving a thin mist coiling along the valley below. Lucas stood at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the smoke from his chimney twist upward into the gray. Inside, the fire burned low, but its warmth lingered. The German Shepherd mother slept near it, her head resting on her paws, the curve of her body enclosing 8 small shapes breathing softly. Lucas moved quietly around them, the creak of his boots muffled by the rug. There was a peace here, fragile but real, a rhythm of breath and warmth that made him hesitate to disturb it. Yet the same thought kept gnawing at him. Where had she come from? He couldn't stop picturing her walking through that storm, the snow clinging to her fur, the pups trailing behind like shadows. It didn't feel accidental. It felt like purpose. When the firewood ran low, he shrugged on his coat and stepped outside. The cold bit instantly at his face, sharp and clean. His breath fogged the air as he followed the faint trail of paw prints leading down the hill behind the cabin. Each step sank deep into the snow, the ground uneven beneath the new crust. The forest had a muted kind of beauty after the storm. No birds, no movement, only the whisper of melting ice. As the slope descended, the prints deepened, becoming irregular. He found broken branches, bits of fur snagged on bark, and the faintest trace of blood, probably from her paws. The trail led him toward the river that wound through the valley, half frozen, its edges rimmed with jagged shards of ice. When he reached the bank, his breath caught. Near the water's edge, buried beneath fallen branches, he found what looked like the remnants of a den, an old hollow between 2 roots, its entrance packed with mud and snow. The place was ruined now, half submerged in ice. The river had risen during the storm, swallowing part of the bank. A small piece of fabric, maybe an old tarp, clung to a branch nearby, torn and stiff with frost. Lucas crouched, brushing the snow aside with his glove. Inside the hollow he found scattered fur, paw marks, and the faint, unmistakable smell of life once lived there. He exhaled slowly, realizing what it meant. She moved them to survive. The storm hadn't just been a danger, it had been a deadline. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark water swirling below the ice. The sound of it reminded him of something else. A different river, a different storm. He saw flashes of brown floodwater under a foreign sun, the roar of wind and the cry of men trapped beneath debris. Iraq. Spring of 2012. His unit had been pinned near a bridge collapse after days of rain. He remembered jumping into that current, rope tied to his waist, pulling a teammate to safety while shouting orders that barely cut through the noise. The man had lived. But the next one hadn't. Miller. The current had taken him before Lucas could reach him. Now, standing by this quiet Vermont river. The memory clawed its way up through the years like something half-buried. He clenched his jaw and looked away. The shepherd had done what he couldn't. Saved everyone she loved from the flood. For the first time, the line between man and animal, soldier and survivor, blurred completely. A voice behind him broke the silence. "You always find the hard places to stand, don't you?" Lucas turned. Martha Higgins was trudging down the path, her small frame wrapped in a thick wool coat and scarf. Her gray hair peeked out from beneath a knitted cap, and she leaned on a wooden walking stick. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes light hazel, sharp as ever, carried a calm that could silence noise. "Didn't expect to see you this far out," Lucas said. I figured you'd come looking for where she came from, she replied, nodding toward the river. You've always been like that, needing to know the beginning of every story. Lucas managed a faint smile. Old habits. I guess I can't leave a mystery unsolved. Martha joined him by the water, looking at the ruined den. Poor thing, she murmured. I wonder how long she's been out here alone. Long enough to know how to survive, Lucas said. The older woman's gaze drifted to the horizon where the mist began to thin into sunlight. You know, she said after a pause, my David was like that dog, always going back for someone else. He was in the Marines. Got caught in a flash flood outside Fallujah. Saved 3 men before. She stopped, her voice catching just slightly. Before the 4th took him with the current. Lucas said nothing. The ache behind his ribs deepened. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Martha shook her head. Don't be. I'm proud of him. But I'll tell you something, Lucas. Sometimes I wish he'd learned when to stop going back. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Lucas stared at the broken den again. Stopping never felt like an option to people like us, he said. Martha looked at him, a faint, knowing smile crossing her lips. Maybe it's time you learn that it can be. She turned and started back up the hill. Come on, before we freeze solid. I brought something warm in the truck. They walked in silence through the trees, the sound of their boots muffled by snow. When they reached her old pickup, she handed him a thermos. The scent of coffee and cinnamon drifted out when he opened it. You keep feeding her? Martha asked as she brushed snow off the hood. Yeah, milk and broth for now. She trusts me enough to eat from my hand. That's good. You should talk to someone from the wildlife center. She said there's a vet, Dr. Emma Lewis. Runs the Cedar Ridge Rescue. She's young, but she knows her work. Drove all the way from Montpelier last month to help a fox with frostbite. Lucas nodded. I'll call her. The dog deserves more than I can offer. Martha smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe she's offering you something you haven't had in a long time. He didn't answer, but her words followed him all the way back to the cabin. The sun had begun to slide behind the ridges, the light softening to amber. Inside, the shepherd lifted her head when he entered, ears pricking, eyes alert. The pups squirmed against her side, warm and safe. Lucas crouched beside them, brushing snow from his coat. You picked one hell of a spot, he murmured. River almost took it all. The dog blinked slowly, her gaze calm and knowing. Lucas reached for the phone on the counter, hesitating before dialing. He hadn't made a call that mattered in years. His thumb hovered over the buttons, his reflection faint in the frosted glass of the window. Finally, he breathed out and dialed the number Martha had given him. When the line clicked open, a woman's voice answered. Steady, professional, lightly touched with warmth. Cedar Ridge Rescue. This is Dr. Emma Lewis. Her tone alone told him she was the kind of person who ran toward trouble, not away from it. Hi, Doctor, Lucas said. My name's Lucas Grant. I think there's someone here who needs your help. He glanced at the shepherd resting by the fire. Her pups nestled close. A mother, actually. By the time Dr. Emma Lewis arrived, the storm had thinned into a quiet drizzle of snowflakes drifting through morning light. The forest lay still beneath a pale sky, each tree heavy with frost, each breath of wind carrying the faint scent of cedar and smoke. Lucas stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath forming small clouds as he watched a dark green Jeep crawl up the hill. The engine's hum broke the silence like a voice too long absent. Emma stepped out, brushing snow from her jacket. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with fair skin touched by winter's flush. Her hair, light auburn and loosely tied, escaped its braid in soft curls that brushed against her neck. She wore a thick navy parka over jeans, and leather boots scuffed from fieldwork. There was a steadiness in her eyes, the color of misted glass, the kind that belonged to someone who'd seen hurt before but refused to harden from it. "Lucas Grant?" she asked, extending a gloved hand. He nodded. "You're the vet." "Dr. Emma Lewis," she confirmed, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm but warm. "You sounded calm on the phone." "Most people panic when they say, 'a mother and 8 puppies.'" "I used to deal with worse situations," he replied dryly. "I guessed that from your tone," she said, smiling faintly. "You've got that ex-military stillness about you?" Lucas didn't answer. He motioned toward the cabin. "They're inside by the fire." Emma stepped in and knelt beside the shepherd without hesitation. The mother lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes weary but not fearful. Emma spoke softly, her tone low and even. "Hey, beautiful. You did good." She reached out her hand, letting the dog sniff first, before gently stroking the fur between her ears. Her movements were practiced, measured, patient, full of unspoken respect. "She trusts quickly," Emma said. "She didn't at first," Lucas murmured. "She carried them here through the storm. The old den by the river's gone." Emma looked up at him, eyes thoughtful. "Then she chose well." For the next hour they worked together without many words. Emma unpacked her kit: bandages, antiseptic, a small stethoscope, and blankets that smelled faintly of hay. She checked each puppy in turn, murmuring notes to herself. Good heart rates. A little underweight. Dehydration mild but manageable. When she was done, she turned to the mother. "She's exhausted but healthy, stronger than most I've seen in the wild." Lucas crouched beside her, helping spread fresh bedding. "She hasn't eaten much, only milk and broth." "Then she's saving the good stuff for her babies," Emma said softly, almost smiling. "They always do." Outside, snow began to fall again. Lazy, gentle flakes that melted on their sleeves. Emma stepped out onto the porch, surveying the space. "She'll need somewhere safer once the fire cools at night," she said. "Something close enough that she doesn't feel trapped." She pointed to the corner of the porch, sheltered by the cabin wall. "There. We can build a small shelter. Open front, straw bedding, windproof." Lucas fetched tools and old planks from the shed, his movements automatic, precise. Emma helped, her gloves dusted with sawdust and melting snow. They worked side by side beneath the falling flakes, the rhythm of their hammering filling the quiet. For Lucas, the act of building felt strange, familiar but new. His hands had built barricades, not homes. But watching Emma work with focus and quiet determination, he found the task oddly grounding. She measured each cut carefully, double-checking every corner. "You're thorough," he remarked. She smiled faintly. "I learned that from my father. He was a carpenter." "Said wood rewards patience, and so do living things." "What made you switch from building houses to fixing animals?" Emma's hammer slowed. "I lost a dog when I was 17. He got hit by a truck. I promised myself I'd never stand by helpless again." She brushed sawdust from her gloves. "You?" Lucas paused, gaze on the horizon. "I lost people. Couldn't save all of them. Guess this feels like a second chance." Their eyes met for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding born not of words, but of scars that mirrored one another. By late afternoon, the shelter stood finished. A small, sturdy structure of wood and straw. Its roof slanted against the wind. Emma stepped back, brushing snow from her coat. She can decide whether to stay inside or move out here. The choice has to be hers. Lucas nodded. I understand that better than you think. Emma smiled softly. I believe you do. She gathered her tools, her cheeks flushed with the cold. I'll check in tomorrow. If she moves them here tonight, that's a good sign. If not, she's still deciding if she trusts you. As she packed her Jeep, Martha's old blue sedan pulled into the drive. She stepped out, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, a thermos steaming in her hand. Looks like I missed all the work, she said, smiling. Emma wiped her hands on her jacket and extended a polite hand. Dr. Lewis, ma'am, the rescue center. Martha Higgins, the older woman said warmly. You're doing God's work, dear. She handed Lucas the thermos. Tea with honey. You both look frozen through. They stood for a while in easy silence, sipping tea and watching the snow deepen around the porch. Then Martha looked toward the shepherd, visible through the cabin window. If she decides to stay, she said quietly, give her a name, Lucas. Something that means gratitude. He didn't answer, but her words lingered as Emma said her goodbyes and drove off into the dusk. The sound of the Jeep faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of fire and the whisper of snow against the glass. Lucas lingered outside, his breath clouding the air, the world dimming into twilight. The forest exhaled a faint mist that curled around the trees like smoke. Behind him, the mother dog stirred. He turned and saw her standing at the cabin door, her amber eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. Without hesitation, she stepped out into the snow, one puppy gently held in her mouth. She crossed the porch to the new shelter, slipped inside, and placed the pup onto the straw. Then she returned to the cabin, picked up another and another. Lucas watched from the doorway, the firelight spilling behind him, the snow whispering beneath her paws. Trip after trip. She carried them carefully until the last one was tucked safe beside her in the small wooden shelter. When she finally settled, her body curved protectively around them, breath steady, eyes half closed. Lucas smiled, his voice low but sure. From now on, he whispered, your name is Grace. The wind sighed softly through the pines, as if agreeing. The sky that morning was the color of ash. A faint wind stirred the snow that had settled overnight, brushing thin trails of white against the window panes of Lucas's cabin. Inside, the fire burned low, its embers glowing like small, patient hearts. Grace lay curled in the wooden shelter by the porch, her body a wall of warmth around her litter. 8 small bundles of fur shifted and whimpered in sleep, but one, the smallest, lay unusually still. Lucas noticed first. He had stepped out with a mug of coffee steaming in his hand, meaning only to check on them before dawn fully broke. The soft sound of breathing had always calmed him, like a rhythm that belonged to a better world. But this morning, that rhythm faltered. The smallest pupatiny, black and tan one with a faint white patch on its chest, struggled to breathe. Each inhale shallow, each exhale slower than the last. Its ribs fluttered like paper. Grace, he whispered. The mother lifted her head. Her amber eyes met his. Steady and alert, she knew. Without growling or protest, she nosed the pup gently, as if urging it to wake. It didn't. Then, in a movement so deliberate it made Lucas's throat tighten, she picked up the puppy and placed it at his feet. Her gaze lingered, not fearful, not pleading, but trusting. Lucas crouched, the weight of her gesture hitting him like a memory from long ago. He thought of the way soldiers sometimes passed their wounded to the medic, not with words, but with the quiet understanding that said, "Take care of him." He swallowed hard, then hurried inside. The pup cradled against his chest. By the time Emma arrived, the light had begun to change, soft gold slipping through the trees. She stepped out of her Jeep, carrying her worn leather bag, the scent of antiseptic and hay following her. Her auburn hair was tied back under a wool cap, cheeks flushed from the cold. When Lucas met her at the door, she didn't need explanation. One look at his face was enough. "She's fading," he said, voice tight. Emma nodded. "Already moving." "Show me." Inside, she cleared a small space on the table and laid down a towel. Her movements were precise but gentle, every action shaped by both experience and empathy. She checked the pup's heartbeat with a stethoscope, her brow furrowing. "Weak, but still there. Cold, though. We need to warm her fast." Lucas brought blankets and the old heating pad he'd used on a shoulder injury. Emma wrapped the tiny body in layers of flannel, rubbing small circles along its chest. "You have any milk left?" He nodded, pouring the last of the formula they'd made days ago. Emma filled a small syringe and pressed it to the pup's mouth. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured. "You've made it through worse than this." Grace watched from the doorway, head low, eyes following every movement. Her posture was tense but not hostile, more like a parent waiting outside an operating room. When Lucas reached toward her, she didn't flinch. She simply exhaled once, a sound that carried exhaustion and faith all at once. They worked for hours. Lucas took turns holding the pup against his chest, his hands trembling slightly. "Feels like holding a heartbeat that's trying to run away," he said quietly. Emma didn't reply. She just adjusted the syringe, feeding small drops between the pup's lips. At one point, the fire sputtered. Lucas got up to add more wood. Emma looked around the cabin. The framed photograph of a Navy unit on the mantel. The folded American flag in a glass box. She studied his face as he crouched by the fire. The way his eyes had that distant focus she'd seen in other veterans, the kind that meant he'd left pieces of himself in places most people never wanted to imagine. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked softly. He gave a faint smile without turning. "Not like this. But yeah. Different kind of rescue, same feeling, same helplessness." Emma nodded. "The difference is, this time, you can stay." He looked at her then, a brief, unguarded look, and she saw the truth of it. As night fell, snow began again, soft and endless. The cabin glowed in the darkness like a small lantern in an ocean of white. Grace stayed close to the doorway, sometimes pacing, sometimes lying down, but never truly resting. Lucas and Emma alternated shifts, warming milk, checking the pup's pulse, whispering small encouragements neither could explain. Sometime after midnight, the tiny dog began to stir. Its breathing deepened, uneven but stronger. A weak sound, more sigh than bark, escaped its throat. Emma smiled, her eyes tired but bright. "She's fighting." Lucas let out a slow breath, as if he'd been holding it for hours. "So was I," he said quietly. They stayed that way until the first streaks of dawn stretched across the snow. Light spilled through the window, painting the cabin gold. The pup blinked for the first time, eyes opening, small and uncertain, like a soul deciding whether to stay. Emma laughed softly, relief shaking her voice. "There you go, little one. Welcome back." Grace rose from the doorway and walked to them. Lucas hesitated, but Emma stepped back. The mother reached the table, sniffed the pup gently, then looked at Lucas. Without a sound, she licked his hand. Once, warm and slow. It broke something open inside him. The tears came sudden and hard. They weren't loud, just steady, his shoulders shaking as he pressed a hand to his face. It wasn't grief. It was release. Emma looked away, giving him the privacy she knew he needed. Grace stayed close, her head against his knee, her breath steady and real. When Lucas finally looked up, the world outside the cabin seemed softer somehow. The snow had stopped, and sunlight glittered through the trees like a promise kept. The pup nestled against its mother, alive and breathing. And for the first time since leaving the Navy, Lucas Grant let himself believe in something again. The wind began as a whisper, then rose to a growl that shook the windows of the cabin. By late afternoon, the storm had returned, with a fury that belonged to no season but winter's last stand. Snow fell in thick, angry waves, erasing the outlines of trees, the path, and even the small shelter that stood just beyond the porch. Lucas watched from the window, his reflection merging with the swirling white beyond. The fire behind him burned strong, its light flickering across his face. But his eyes were fixed on the darkening world outside. He could feel the shift in the air, that strange, silent pressure that came before nature unleashed its full strength. The storm wasn't just weather, it felt alive, like an old enemy returning for one last reckoning. Lucas pulled on his heavy coat, the same one he'd worn during his first winter in Vermont, and stepped outside. The wind hit him with brutal force. Snow whipped his face, sharp as needles. The shelter by the porch, the one he and Emma had built, groaned under the weight of ice and snow. Grace was inside, curled around her pups, her fur dusted white. She looked up when she saw him, calm, steady, waiting. "Hang on, girl," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "We're not losing this one." He waded through knee-deep snow, each step a fight. The boards of the shelter creaked, and then, with a sound like splintering bones, one side gave way. Lucas lunged forward just in time, pulling the tarp and straw back as the roof collapsed inward. Grace barked once, sharp, commanding, and stood her ground. She didn't flee. She stayed, pressing herself between the falling boards and her puppies until Lucas reached her. "Not today," he muttered, lifting the broken planks aside. His gloves froze stiff as he scooped the pups one by one into his jacket. Grace followed close, her body pressed against his leg as they fought their way back to the cabin. By the time he pushed the door open, both man and dog were coated in ice. Inside, warmth hit them like mercy. Lucas laid the pups by the hearth, rubbing them dry with a towel. Grace shook herself free of snow, sending a spray of melted ice across the wooden floor. Her breathing was heavy, but even. She looked toward the door again, as if expecting the storm to follow them in. Lucas shut it tight and bolted it. The sound of the wind battering the walls filled the small space. Outside, the forest howled, but within those walls, life clung to its fragile rhythm. He sank into the chair near the fire, Grace at his feet. The cabin flickered between light and shadow, the storm's voice roaring against the roof. It felt like being back on the battlefield. The thunder, the pressure, the sense that everything depended on endurance. Only this time, there was no mission, no command, no radio call, only instinct. Grace rose, pacing toward the door. Her ears twitched with every crash of wind. She planted herself before the wooden frame, her stance tall and still, a silent sentinel. Lucas watched her, the firelight tracing the muscles along her back, the tension in her body, the strength in her stillness. He had seen men do the same, stand guard through the night so others could sleep. It hit him then how alike they were. Soldier and mother, both bound by the same unspoken duty, to protect, no matter the cost. "Stand down," he said softly. But Grace didn't move. She stayed where she was, her gaze fixed on the storm, as if daring it to come closer. Across the road, in her own small farmhouse, Martha Higgins sat by a window lit by candlelight. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving her world painted in flickering gold. On the table beside her stood a framed photograph, a young Marine with a crooked grin, his uniform pressed, his eyes bright. Her son. She traced a finger across the glass, her lips moving silently in prayer. "Watch over them, David," she whispered. "There's another mother fighting her storm tonight." She smiled faintly, the kind that carries both grief and grace, and leaned back, watching the snow beat against her window. Outside, the night raged on, but inside her heart, there was peace, because she believed no battle of love was ever fought alone. Back at the cabin, Lucas added wood to the fire. The pups were asleep again, piled together in a tangle of warmth and tiny heartbeats. Grace remained by the door, her fur shimmering faintly in the firelight. Her eyes glowed amber, wild, alert, alive. The storm thundered around them, rattling the walls, but Lucas knew she wouldn't leave her post. He stood and crossed to her, placing a hand on her back. "It's okay," he said. "You've done enough." Grace turned her head slightly, her muzzle brushing his wrist. She didn't move away. Lucas left his hand there, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath, the same rhythm that had carried her through the blizzard, through hunger and exhaustion, through fear itself. The hours crawled by. The wind screamed. The fire hissed. At some point, Lucas must have dozed in the chair, because when his eyes opened, the room was pale with dawn. The storm had passed. The wind was gone. He stood slowly, every joint aching, and walked to the window. The world outside was transformed, the snow no longer furious, but soft and endless, gleaming beneath the morning sun. The trees sparkled like glass sculptures, their branches heavy but unbroken. The air felt new, rinsed clean by survival. Turning back to the fire, Lucas saw them. Grace and her litter nestled together on the rug. She had finally left the door. Her body was half curved around the pups, half leaning against his leg where he'd fallen asleep beside the hearth. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder. "Looks like we made it," he whispered. Grace stirred, lifted her head, and pressed her muzzle against his chest. The warmth of her touch was quiet, honest, and unguarded, the kind of gratitude words could never capture. Lucas closed his eyes, the sound of the fire soft in his ears, the weight of peace settling where war had once lived. Outside, sunlight poured across the snow, glinting like small fragments of hope scattered across the land. And for the first time in his memory, Lucas felt no need to brace himself against what came next. Grace and her pups slept soundly against him, and the soldier finally allowed himself to rest. By early March, the world outside Lucas's cabin began to thaw. The snow that had buried Vermont's forest for months was pulling back into the earth, leaving behind patches of dark soil and the first whispers of green. The air smelled different now, softer, almost sweet, touched by the promise of new life. The river that had once nearly taken Grace's den now ran clear and steady, reflecting the sunlight like a blade of glass. On the porch, Lucas sat with his coffee, watching chaos unfold in the most beautiful form imaginable. The puppies, now 10 weeks old, tumbled over one another in wild play. Their legs were too long for their bodies, their ears too big for their heads, and their sense of balance non-existent. The largest male tried to drag a stick twice his size across the yard. The smallest female barked at her own reflection in a puddle. Their fur gleamed black and gold beneath the sun, and their laughter, for it sounded like laughter to Lucas, filled the space that had once known only silence. Grace lay nearby, stretched across the porch, with her head resting on her paws, eyes half closed, but watchful. She was stronger now. Her fur thick and glossy again, her body lean and confident. Every so often, she lifted her head to nudge a pup that wandered too close to the steps, or barked softly to call them back when they strayed too far. Lucas smiled at the sight. She had become the heart of this place, as if the cabin, the woods, and even the wind itself revolved quietly around her. Emma arrived just before noon. Her green Jeep rolled up the dirt road, kicking up small clouds of mud instead of snow this time. She stepped out with a box of supplies in one arm and a grin that carried spring's warmth. Her auburn hair shimmered in the sunlight, loosely tied back. Her cheeks flushed pink from the drive. She wore a forest green jacket with rolled sleeves, jeans tucked into scuffed boots, and sunglasses that did little to hide the kindness in her expression. "Looks like the rescue operation was a success," she said, smiling as she stepped onto the porch. Lucas leaned against the railing. "You tell me, Doc. You're the professional." Emma crouched beside the puppies, who immediately swarmed her boots, tails wagging furiously. "Healthy," she murmured, checking them one by one. "Curious. Mischievous. Exactly how they should be." She laughed when one tried to climb her knee. "You little soldier have no sense of boundaries." Martha arrived not long after. Her old sedan creaking into the clearing, she stepped out holding a covered dish in a paper bag. "Before you ask," she said, "it's apple pie." "And no, Lucas, you don't get to claim it all for yourself." She was wrapped in a soft gray sweater and wore her hair pinned neatly at the back. The lines on her face seemed gentler now, her steps steadier. There was peace in her eyes, the kind that comes from watching life begin again where it almost ended. Inside the cabin, sunlight spilled through the windows, catching the dust in golden motes. Emma set up her supplies on the table: syringes, cotton, a clipboard, a small cooler with vaccines. The puppies whined and protested when she began, but her voice was calm and soothing. "Easy there," she whispered to each one. "This means more playtime later." Lucas helped hold them steady, his big hands surprisingly gentle. Emma noticed the way his touch had changed. Not the rigid carefulness of a man afraid to break something fragile, but the ease of someone who finally trusted his own strength again. When the last pup was done, Lucas released a breath. "They didn't even bite me this time," he said. "Progress," Emma replied with a grin. "You're getting good at this." Martha poured tea from her thermos and passed the mugs around. The scent of apples and cinnamon filled the air. "I can't remember the last time this place felt so alive," she said, looking out the window. "Used to be so quiet up here." Lucas smiled faintly. "Quiet's overrated." "Now you sound human again," Martha teased. Emma laughed, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. "Actually, I was going to ask if you'd consider joining us at Cedar Ridge, even part-time. We're short on hands this spring, and you've got a natural way with them." Lucas raised a brow. "You want me to volunteer?" "I want you to do what you're already doing," she said gently. "Helping things find their footing again." He hesitated, staring into his cup. For a long moment, only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then he nodded once. "Maybe it's about time I tried saving something that can actually be saved." Emma's smile was small but knowing. "We all need rescuing sometimes." Martha looked between them, the corners of her mouth curling upward. "Sounds like spring's doing its job after all," she said softly. The afternoon passed in warmth and laughter. The pups napped in the sun, Grace keeping lazy watch beside them. When Emma left, she promised to bring adoption forms for the puppies once they were ready. "They'll need good homes," she said. Lucas looked toward the yard where the pups had begun chasing each other again. "Yeah," he murmured. They already have one. Later that evening, the sun sank low behind the trees, turning the snowmelt into ribbons of gold. The air buzzed faintly with insects, a sound Lucas hadn't heard in months. Inside, he sat at his desk, the light of dusk spilling over his shoulder. On a small piece of scrap wood, he carved words with his pocket knife, slow and deliberate. When he finished, he carried it outside and nailed it above the porch. The letters were uneven but clear. Winter shelter. The first place we were chosen to stay. Grace rested on the porch steps, her fur catching the last of the sunlight. The puppies tumbled beside her, their tiny bodies glowing in the amber light. Lucas sat down next to her, the smell of pine and wood smoke filling the air. "Not bad, huh?" he said quietly. Grace lifted her head, brushed her muzzle against his arm, and sighed. A deep, contented sound. For the first time since he could remember, Lucas didn't feel like a visitor in his own life. The cabin wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was home. The first snow of the new year came quietly, like an old friend returning without a word. It fell in soft, delicate flakes that seemed to remember where they had landed before. On the railings, the cabin roof, the pine branches that had grown a little taller since last winter. The mountains of Vermont were hushed again, though this time, not in loneliness, but in peace. Lucas Grant stood by the window, buttoning the jacket of his Navy working uniform, the same green, gray, blue camouflage that had once carried him through war-torn cities and broken skies. He hadn't worn it in nearly a year. The fabric felt heavier now, not because of the memories it held, but because it reminded him how far he'd come from the man who once hid inside this cabin. His reflection in the glass caught him off guard. The short, dark hair streaked with gray, the light-trimmed beard, and the calm, steady eyes that no longer ran from what they'd seen. Behind him, the cabin glowed with life. The shelves were lined with framed photographs, not of soldiers or medals, but of 8 small German Shepherd puppies with new families, each picture marked with a handwritten note. One read, "She's training to be a therapy dog." Another, "He sleeps with my son every night." Grace's pups had all found homes. All except her. She still lived here, as she had since that first winter night. Now 6 years old, Grace carried herself with the grace of a creature who had endured and triumphed. Her black and tan coat gleamed in the soft light, the scar along her flank now barely visible beneath the thick fur. She walked slowly to Lucas's side, pressing her head against his leg, her amber eyes lifted to his face, questioning, patient, as if she too sensed the weight of this day. Lucas smiled faintly. "You remember, don't you?" he said, his voice low. "This is where it all started." Outside, the porch waited. The same old boards that had groaned beneath his boots that night when Grace appeared from the storm. A pup hanging from her jaws. He opened the door, and a gust of cold air swept in. Grace hesitated, glancing up at him once more, then stepped forward, her paws sinking into the fresh layer of snow. Lucas followed, his boots pressing deep beside hers. Their tracks formed 2 lines that ran side by side toward the edge of the porch. The morning light was pale gold. The forest beyond shimmered under a thin veil of frost. Grace stopped halfway down the steps and looked back, her ears pricking up. For a heartbeat, Lucas saw her as she had been that first night, trembling but unbroken, desperate, yet brave. Now she was different, steady, sure, belonging. He stood quietly, his breath visible in the air, and realized that the silence no longer hurt. It was the same kind of silence soldiers feel after the last explosion fades, the one that tells them they've lived long enough to hear it. The sound of a car broke through the stillness. A familiar green Jeep pulled into the clearing, followed by an old gray sedan. Emma stepped out first, her auburn hair hidden under a cream-knit hat, her long coat dusted with snowflakes. She waved when she saw him. "You wore it," she called. Smiling. Lucas laughed softly. "Didn't think I'd ever put this thing on again." Emma walked up the porch, brushing snow from her gloves. She looked at him with that same quiet understanding she always carried, the kind that came from seeing pain and choosing not to look away from it. "Sometimes," she said, "we wear old uniforms just to remind ourselves how far we've walked without them." Behind her, Martha Higgins climbed the porch steps more slowly, holding onto the railing with her mittened hand. Her hair was fully white now, tucked beneath a wool cap, but her eyes still had the sparkle of someone who believed in small miracles. She handed Lucas a pie tin wrapped in foil. "Apple again," she said with a grin. "Tradition, right?" Lucas accepted it with a warm chuckle. Wouldn't be a proper visit without it. They all stood together for a moment, watching Grace pad across the snow. The dog turned back toward the cabin, her paws leaving a perfect trail beside Lucas's boot prints. Martha's gaze softened. "You know," she murmured, "not everyone who leaves the battlefield ever finds peace again." She turned toward him, her voice gentle. "But you did, Lucas, and you found it right here on your own porch." For a long time, no one spoke. The snow fell lightly, catching on their coats and hair. The firelight from inside the cabin glowed through the open door, casting warmth across the threshold. Emma stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do now?" Lucas looked toward the mountains, their peaks bright against the morning sky. "Keep building," he said simply. "Maybe not walls or fences, but lives." He smiled down at Grace, who had come to stand beside him again. "She taught me that home isn't something you hide in, it's something you share." Martha nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a man who finally belongs somewhere." Grace leaned her head against his knee. Lucas crouched, his hand brushing over her fur. The snow continued to fall, slow and soundless, like the final words of a prayer. Behind them, the cabin stood steady and bright, its porch creaking softly under their weight, a witness to everything that had begun and ended there. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and apple pie. Emma laughed as one of the falling snowflakes landed on Grace's nose, making her sneeze. Lucas's laughter joined hers, low and unguarded. The warmth spilling from the cabin door framed them in soft amber light. 3 humans and 1 dog, bound not by survival anymore, but by something quieter, stronger, belonging. Lucas reached for the door handle, but paused. The fire's glow flickered against the snow. He looked down at Grace one last time before stepping inside. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "Let's go home." The porch creaked as they turned. Snow fell behind them, covering their footprints, but the memory of them side by side would remain. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. They come quietly, in the form of a second chance, a loyal friend, or a warm light waiting behind a cabin door. Lucas thought his story had ended on a battlefield, but Grace found him in the snow, through a creature who only wanted to love and be loved in return. Grace was more than a dog. She was a reminder that heaven often whispers through the smallest acts of compassion. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. The miracle you're praying for might not look like a rescue. It might look like the courage to open your door again, to forgive yourself, or to offer kindness to someone who's been left out in the cold.